Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers, presented by FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education. Ant, let's try this again and see if you can maybe not screw it up completely this one time. Just this one time. What's new and exciting in your world this week?
Bernie Sanders?
That would be amusing, which is exactly the reason I know it's never going to happen.
How about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez?
Nope, but she may make an appearance in a minute. Just saying. Just saying. Stay tuned. Stay tuned one more minute and we'll figure out what happens.
The two of them, among other prominent politicians, have branded themselves democratic socialists, which I guess is the nice, fuzzy form of socialism.
Yeah, sure. It makes it sound like people voted to take away your stuff instead of just taking away your
stuff.
Well,
actually, that is. Democratic socialism is a democratic political system paired with a socialist economic system. Under democratic socialism, the people would vote for how to direct the economy's resources. So you can imagine we might vote for more health care, or we might vote for more green infrastructure, and then the government would use its power to force people to produce these things.
What could possibly go wrong?
You're right.
This has worked so well everywhere it's ever been tried. I can't wait to do it here.
Well, but see, that's the thing. When people contrast capitalistic systems with democratic systems, I like to point out that capitalism is the ultimate democratic system. Every dollar you spend is a vote you're casting in favor of a product. When you, James, spend your dollars on Coke Zero, that provides more resources to the companies and workers that bring Coke Zero to supermarket shelves. When I, as I will the first chance I get, spend fewer dollars on Comcast, I deny resources to the companies and workers that bring Comcast service to my door. Those dollars are quite literally votes that influence whether certain products will survive or perish. The trick to getting what you want in a capitalist system is to take these dollars as votes seriously. And here we have an interesting example. A group of people concerned with climate change formed an investment firm called Engine Number One. Rather than lobbying government to force companies to be greener, Engine Number One decided to take dollars as votes seriously and work with rather than against capitalism to effect change. Engine Number One raised investment money from people who are concerned with climate change. With that investment money, it purchased enough stock in Exxon and cajoled major stockholders to obtain 3 seats on Exxon's board of directors. Now, those 3 seats only constitute 25% of the board, but still, these 3 members will be pushing Exxon from the inside to shift toward alternative energies.
That's great as far as it goes, right? I suspect that they're going to have all kinds of problems trying to reconcile their ecological point of view with the economic reality of running a company. But hey, that's their job now to figure it out.
Right, to figure it out. And this is the beauty of the thing. People have actually put their money where their mouths are. They have voted for Exxon to move in this direction. Maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't. But the fact is, this is capitalism as an actual democratic system.
I do think it's interesting. It'll be fascinating to see what happens in those meetings.
Yeah.
To be a fly on that wall.
I know, would it be great?
But, I don't get too worked up over these things. I suspect a number of shareholders in Exxon will. This is going to force them to accept a different kind of outcome. I know when I buy stocks, I don't care about literally anything other than what's my rate of return.
That's the interesting thing, because if indeed these 3 board members have good ideas for moving Exxon forward into alternative energies, it will attract investment money. People elsewhere will say, yeah, I believe their vision. I'm going to put money into Exxon, and they'll vote with their dollars.
Look, of course that happens, but in the final analysis, all that matters is the outcome. And I'm not at all convinced that they're going to get bigger returns doing this. Well, and if that's the case, they're going to have to take their toys and go home.
Well, I think there's a long-run view here, and that is that fossil fuels are on their way out, whether it be by legislative fiat or whether it be simply by technological change. Exxon, if it wants to survive into the next century, needs to reformulate itself because it, as an oil company, isn't going to exist 100 years from now.
I think that's actually incorrect. But what I know to be incorrect is that you can't say, do X, and all the people will clap their hands. Shareholders will not. They don't care about your brand new social theory. They care about the returns in their retirement accounts. And I don't blame them at all. If I were what I would consider to be in too many shares of Exxon right now, I would sell. This would be terrifying. I want companies whose chief goal is to make a profit, not whose chief goal is to make a statement.
Right, you do. But there are plenty of other people who are willing to trade off less of a return in exchange for more of something else.
And a lot of people aren't going to be able to differentiate because they have their retirement accounts in index funds and they are invested in Exxon, whether they
know it or not. Right, yeah.
So all of these things swim below the surface here. I'm going to keep an eye on this. I think this is fascinating. It's as right an answer as there could be, I think. I think you get a lot of variations of lousy answers here. I've got something that's at least in the same universe. I was reading MSN.com, and people might be shocked to know that I do read MSN.com, but there it is. And a story jumped out at me today about real estate and the problems that are emerging for people who would like to buy houses, but all of a sudden are priced out in a monumental way. This article was written to discuss what's going on in Star, Idaho, but it's pretty easy to generalize the sorts of things that are being said there. Housing prices have just about doubled in some places in the last 6-8 months. This isn't a long-term thing. And look, I bought a house almost exactly 2 years ago now. Mine's up 25%. If you could do that kind of return in the stock market, you'd never stop buying things.
Right.
What's the net result? People are buying houses without benefit of appraisals, without benefit of inspections. They're just moving whatever they have to move to get their bid to the top of the pile right this second.
Oh, this sounds so familiar.
Yeah.
Did we learn nothing?
If only there had been something from our past that we could have taken a lesson from. But here we are all over again. Look, I just refinanced, and I can tell you, they're not taking a very close look at things in that area. You could finance a house right now without a whole lot of people getting up in your business. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what precipitated the last housing crisis.
And it wasn't like it was half a century ago. It was 12 years. Come on, people.
My children remember it.
Yeah.
It's not like they remember Led Zeppelin, but they remember the housing crisis. For crying out loud. So yeah, that's where we are. And I don't know if I've ever told this story. When I got pre-approved to buy my house in Pennsylvania, I had asked for $250,000, knowing that I really needed $200,000. And they approved it so fast, without looking into anything that I could see, that after I signed the last form, I looked to the banker and I said, listen, how much would you have approved me for? And he said, don't hold me to it, but $450 to $550 maybe.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And I said, buddy, I'd be homeless by April if that was what you were going to get. And he looked at me at the desk and he said, that's not my problem.
You're right. Yeah.
I thought, oh my God, it's everybody's problem.
I bought my first house in 1993, 94, even way back then. I filled out the paperwork and they came back to me and they said, okay, by our calculations, you can afford X dollars per month for mortgage. I said, you are out of your mind. There is no way I can afford that.
Same story for me. I could afford half what they were willing to give me.
Yeah.
And I bought my house in 2005, and you know how soon thereafter everything fell apart. Mm-hmm. But it was pretty obvious that there was a baked-in problem to me then. And I just refinanced here 6 months ago, and it's the same problem.
Yep.
Mark my words, something terrible is about to happen. I'll just leave it at that.
And I'll tell you what will happen is the politicians will immediately turn and blame those greedy bankers.
That's a greedy banker. Yeah, that's probably right. So on that happy note, I take leave of this story until later when I giggle and say, ha ha, I told you so, which will be very little comfort to me, right? I don't want what's to happen, and it's going to. But I did say already that I wanted to talk about Ms. AOC again. And of course, it is the foolishness of the week, which I think you could find her picture on the dictionary entry for this. It gets really interesting, Amp, because, we all know her to be kind of a saber-rattling socialist. Here we learn today that the revolution will have merchandise as well, because she is now pushing out a set of all kinds of branded shirts and the whatnot, featuring her visage on them and this sort of thing.
This socialism brought to you by capitalism.
By capitalism. That's right. That's right. Her initials and the slogans "Tax the Rich" and "Fight for Our Future" appear all over the products. And apparently, People who can't afford their loans or houses or meals will spend that Starbucks coffee money that they set aside for these bits and bobs of merchandise. It impressed me as the most ridiculous thing in the world when I saw it this afternoon.
It's about as ironic as those Che Guevara T-shirts.
Yeah. If Che were alive and cashing the checks.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
Let's remember that Che Guevara is right where he needs to be, dead. And the people who wear that shirt, they seem to have no understanding that he killed homosexuals scores at a time.
Yeah.
He's a terrible human being.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. It's been happening with more and more frequency of late that people ask me some question that has to do with the Constitution, and I have to reply that it seems that our Constitution has ceased to be a constitution in the sense of a document that defines and limits government and has become more of a mission statement. It seems to be the case anymore that the words on the paper don't matter. What matters is what the Supreme Court says the words mean.
I don't see a reasonable argument against that sort of thinking at this point. When you look at the Constitution, it's very clear that the original design was to create a government that would remain limited in key respects. And when we look at the government now, I'm forced to ask the question, how on earth is this beast limited? And how did we get from one place to another? That's actually more of a fascinating question than people might think. As we ramped up to ratification after the Convention of 1787, the Anti-Federalists appeared, and they lodged all kinds of complaints against the Constitution. And when you look at what they complained about, it's actually kind of interesting because first and foremost was the necessary and proper clause. They said this is going to be the thing that opens the door to any sort of adventurism that you're ever going to see. And don't you know, that actually happened.
So let's pause here for a minute. Necessary and proper clause says what?
Article 1, Section 8 lists all of the things that Congress can do. Because the Constitution is a mechanism for limiting government, it can't do anything that's not on the list. However, here's the necessary and proper clause right at the very end that says, okay, you've just got that list of things you can do. And it might be the case that you need another power to bring one of those things into being. If it's necessary and proper, you can do that too, but only if it's necessary and proper. And that's actually a very high bar to pass. And yet the Supreme Court has allowed this to go on unchecked for a couple hundred years at this point, maybe 150. The government over and over and over again just claims everything is necessary and proper. And they mentioned the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause indicates that Congress can regulate commerce among the several states and with Indians not taxed. And the Anti-Federalists said, and by the way, that Commerce Clause is going to be a problem. And then they said the Supremacy Clause, which indicates federal law to be superior to state law. And they said, look, these three things are going to lead to a condition in which all power is just gobbled up by this federal leviathan that you're building. I would submit that that's exactly what happened. They were perfectly prescient on these points.
So I think we have two problems then. The practical problem that the federal government has accrued far more power than the founders intended. But then this other problem kind of in the background that is the one that worries me maybe more so. And that's that the plain words on the page seem not to matter anymore. That we've become almost like the UK. It doesn't have a written constitution. It has a tradition. And it seems to be that that's what's happening here.
I think there's something that's right about that. I don't know its exact contours yet, but if you start to think about the government we've got versus the government that was designed, you take a long look at the history of how we led up from one to the other, you start to realize that the Supreme Court is a problem here in many key respects. But the real problem is the desire on the part of everybody in government to just keep adding to the list. Nobody ever seems to say, well, that's unconstitutional, we can't do that.
Right.
That seems to be a laughable outcome. I'm trained not even to see it. Well, there's your problem. If you're looking at what people are actually doing, you start to realize that the federal government increases its own power over time. This really shouldn't be that shocking. But then this other thing comes in the wake of that. And here's where it gets interesting, I think. When the plain words on the page, as you called them, as I often call them, are contravened, we end up with new unwritten words on the page.
Right.
They're tucked away in Supreme Court decisions and things like this. Well, those things add up over time, and they yield all manner of contradictions in the program. Because you can only say so many times, yeah, okay, Article 1, Section 8, except for this, before you realize that except for this is a category unto itself, and it's far bigger than Article 1, Section 8 ever was, or was ever intended to be. And the interesting bit here is that we've all learned somehow to just go with it.
Right.
Some of us, like us and people like us, people typically on the American right, at least prior to the last 10 years or so, would say things like, no, this is patently unconstitutional. You can't do it. So at least they had something on record, a complaint on record. Now they don't even do that. Now the Constitution is just something to be contravened by both parties.
Yeah, and I can testify to that personally. I often feel like I'm coming across as a crazy person when I say something like, well, that's clearly unconstitutional because it doesn't match what the document says. And people look at me strangely like, well, this thing we want to do, whatever it is clearly a good thing. And so therefore we should do it. It doesn't matter what the paper says.
Yeah, people conflate what they want with constitutional. And that's just not the case. There are all kinds of things that you might want that are patently unconstitutional. And when we realized that earlier in our history and we fought against it to some degree, government remained relatively limited. As time went by and foolishness after foolishness ensued, it came to be the case that the federal government could do almost anything it wanted as long as it took an incremental path. It didn't try to change everything every minute. It changed a little bit here and a little bit there, which over time compounds to a gigantic monster. And Wickard v. Filburn is, I think, the perfect example. You and I have talked about this case before. This case involved a man who was growing, I think it was corn or wheat, whatever it was, on his own property that was inside of a state. It wasn't on a border of two states or any such thing. It's just a simple farm in a single place. This guy starts feeding some of the materials he's growing, the corn or the wheat, to his own cattle. In comes the federal government saying, you can't do that. And he says something like, why the hell not? And they say, interstate commerce. Well, how's it interstate commerce if the material never got off his farm? And the answer was, well, if you didn't grow the extra to serve to your own cattle, you would have had to go get it on the open market, and then interstate commerce would have been impacted. Now, what the hell is going on here? This is just ridiculous. That doesn't pass the smell test, and yet that became the new reality. The Commerce Clause over and over and over again comes to be used as a blunt force tool against finer constitutional points. And they just disappear in its wake. Why? Because once it's used once, the federal government's going to use it over and over and over again. And once it's used once and the Supreme Court has declared it to be constitutional, the Supreme Court of the United States will cease to have any interest in it. And there you go. So what seems to have emerged, and I've just started thinking this, we always say that the podcast is kind of the rough draft of an idea. I freely admit that I might be wrong. I freely admit that I'm likely to have different opinions or more formed opinions moving forward, but it does seem to be the case that over time, the U.S. Constitution has ceased to matter. Yeah. The words on the page are relatively meaningless. Think of the Second Amendment. There will be no gun legislation. Oh, except for all of these things that legislate against the guns. The First Amendment, there will be no anti-religious legislation. Oh, except for all these things, which do exactly that. And you start to realize that what has emerged from our history and these sorts of incremental decisions over time is an odd duck, right? We can't go look everything up in the Constitution because it doesn't really matter anymore. But we talk about the Constitution endlessly. So what we end up having is a constitutional tradition in which the words on the page of our own Constitution are meaningless. But the tradition is not meaningless.
So I'm not too far off calling it a mission statement.
No, not at all. I think that's kind of right. And look, we don't have terminology to describe what's happening because I haven't heard anybody make this argument before. But it does seem to be the case that what emerges, what we're left with, is a constitutional tradition that just simply works around the Constitution itself. The constitutional tradition makes perfect sense, The Constitution makes perfect sense. They do not make perfect sense together. Because together, you have to look at the Constitution itself and say something like, well, that's a dead document now.
Right.
And we've got this living Constitution that's really different. And this is what proponents of monkeying about with the Constitution will say. They'll say our Constitution is a living Constitution. And just because you don't see the words in it that you want, think of education. Is education a federal issue in any way? Well, if you look at the Constitution, the answer is an obvious no. It's barely even a state issue. It's almost always a local issue. But we have a Secretary of Education, a Department of Education. What the hell is that? How does a government of enumerated powers end up having a power that is clearly not enumerated? There's no education. That word doesn't appear in the Constitution. More than that, the thought of that word doesn't appear in the Constitution.
Oh, and it goes more than that. It's all sorts of other things. The EPA, the FDA, pretty much any government agency you can think of.
It certainly includes the vast majority of the cabinet posts, because there's a few that were mentioned in the Constitution, the Department of State, things like this. But having said that, I don't know what the right answer is anymore. The right answer at the inception of all of these constitutional innovations was to resist them, and that didn't happen. By the time you get to the Franklin Roosevelt administration, that's about when this all gets off the ground, although you can make a strong enough case for Hoover right before him. By the time you get to the Roosevelt administration, what you end up seeing is a complete and total reevaluation of government and explosive growth. And from that point to this, that's all we've ever known. So at this point in our history, we don't have anybody. There's nobody with a living memory of anything at all different than what we have right now. And because of that, we all just naturally assume that this is the correct answer. But it's not the constitutional answer. If it were the correct answer once upon a time, honest people would have had a constitutional amendment to satisfy the requirements of the Constitution. Instead, what they did is they just washed it all through the Supreme Court. And what happened then? Well, a pattern was developed. And from that point forward, that's all you had to do. And how much of any of this are regular people in tune with? How much are they aware of? And I think the answer to that question is almost none of it. Why? Because why would they be? They're not interested in monitoring every event of the government. That's not a reasonable expectation. The very reason we have government is to get people out of that role. So you can't complain that they don't pay attention when the actual design is not to pay attention. And what happens? Well, it grows like crazy, as has happened. You can't think of a single thing that government doesn't involve itself with in your day-to-day life, because there is no thing. People are thinking real hard out there right now. I'll just tell you, you can stop. The end of this argument is, well, abstract thought is not regulated by the federal government.
You've said that before, and I'll push back on it, because it is under certain circumstances.
If you can be charged with crimes that you would not be charged with otherwise because of what was going on in your mind as you did something.
Right. Hate crime legislation is thought crime.
It is. It's exactly what thought crime is. So we've ended up with, I think, a relatively rich and vibrant tradition of constitutional law that somehow doesn't have all that much to do with the Constitution itself anymore. And that's a strange place to land.
All right, so let's admit that that's what we have. Moving forward, how does that system work? How do changes come about? Is it simply a matter of a Supreme Court being able to make a good enough argument that previous Supreme Courts had it wrong and therefore the rules should change in the following way?
I don't think that's exactly right. I think that things like that are a thread that run through this thing. But really, the innovation that we're seeing, you would fully expect to find in Congress, but it seems that Congress has ceded so much authority to the president and so much to the Supreme Court on the other side that you don't really see a lot coming out of Congress. And what you do see coming out of Congress is, in no small part, a manifestation of what a president wants, because they work hand in glove with the members of their own party in the Congress. So you've got these two constitutional branches, the executive and the legislative branch, that work together when they are able. And you get all kinds of crackpot innovation there. And then that foolishness ends up getting piped over to the Supreme Court in one shape or another. And the Supreme Court can either choose to weigh in on it or not. Either way, a decision has been rendered. And once the Supreme Court renders a decision, and the executive and the legislative branches figure, okay, we've got that covered now. What else does that cover? Oh, look, here's a big long list of things. Well, it's no surprise what's going to happen here. And it's no surprise that the federal government has, for over 200 years, gotten much, much more powerful than it was ever designed to be.
Extending what's happened over the past 100 years into the next 100 years, do we end up basically in a situation where we have a president who does give or take whatever he wants, provided his party is in majority in Congress, and the Supreme Court being the ultimate arbiters of saying yes or no? And how is any of that different from an oligarchy?
Well, it's not exactly. And I think if you step back and take a look at something like the Affordable Care Act, this is absurd. It's patently unconstitutional. There's no argument that this is a constitutional thing. How do I know that? The word healthcare, medicine, doctor, none of these words appear in the Constitution. Go read the Constitution and come back to me with something that empowers the federal government to have a healthcare program. It doesn't exist. And yet it passed from a president to Congress, back to the president for signature, and then over to the Supreme Court on any number of times by now. And they've given it their blessing every time through.
But more than that, to give their original blessing, they defined certain terms in ways that neither the Congress nor the president had defined them. The fine that was going to be imposed, they called it a tax, and on that they hung their argument that it was constitutional.
And it's all asinine. It's absolutely ridiculous. Mm-hmm. Any reasonable person would look at the Constitution and answer in the way I already have, that this is not constitutional. Now, that might not mean that it's a terrible idea. It could be the best idea ever and still be unconstitutional. Think of prohibition, right? This was an idiotic idea. It required a constitutional amendment. And lo and behold, a bonehead idea like that did pass muster, got the amendment through. And then people realized, oh my God, what have we done? And a few years later, they were smart enough to have another amendment to repeal it. But look at the devices here. This is the honest, honorable way to do things. You look at the Constitution, you compare what you want to what's in there. You realize that what you want is not in there. You amend the Constitution through a very clear process that's listed in the Constitution. And then, only then, is that considered to be the constitutional answer.
So I want to jump off of this question for a moment, go to something parallel. Is it possible that the United States has just become too large to be effectively managed under the Constitution as it was written?
I think I would make the argument that the United States is likely too large to be governed at all. There are no clear answers to how to deal with a landmass as big as ours with a population as big as ours. These are new things that happened over time. I think the only way that we could legitimately hope to run this place is, in fact, oddly enough, with the original design that left lots and lots of things. The vast majority of things were left to the states, that the federal government only did a very few things that were necessarily done at the federal level. So you think things like defense, that's everybody all at once. You think about border control, which is a thing that you probably can't leave to the states. Stuff like this. Not things like healthcare. That's just ridiculous to think this way. I don't blame the politicians for thinking this way because that's what they are. They are people who think that way. And their answer is always, let's grab more power. That's what politicians do. The people who are culpable here are the regular people who I've already said are under no requirement whatsoever to involve themselves with day-to-day politics. They don't want to, and there's no reason to force them to. You can see perfectly where it's going to land. People aren't going to pay attention. The government will grab more power to itself every single time it gets the chance, which means that we're going to tell a very long story about the acquisition of power over time. And you and I talk about this a lot, because how might we measure this? Well, we can measure it by how badly the government monkeys about in the economy. We can talk about how the Federal Register went from 6,000 pages in the 1930s to 160,000 pages and counting at present. This is what government growth looks like. You can stop and ask yourself, how did my lawn become a federally protected wetland? Which happened to all kinds of people. Where does the government have any role in protecting whatever wetlands are? I remember my father-in-law's front lawn was a federally protected wetland, and he couldn't build a garage on the side of his house until he got through all the bureaucrats and had it declared not a wetland.
Wow.
This is just stupid. And you see things like this over and over again. People can always point to something idiotic the federal government has done. But that's not really what this story's about. The story's about how it got to do those things. How it is that everybody fell asleep at the switch and left us with a government that only grows. It's like a ratchet that only turns in one direction. It grows and grows and grows, and it never shrinks. And that's the interesting bit, because what emerges then is a different kind of constitutional tradition. What do we really care about here? We care about free speech a lot here. So that one is left right on the list, and we don't turn our head away from it. Why that one's important and a bunch of other ones aren't, I don't know. But the American people have their favorite things, and that has to matter. You're going to have a lot of trouble if you decide from Congress to get rid of the Catholic Church in the United States.
Right.
That's not going to happen, and we all know that's not going to happen. So why is it that they can violate certain provisions of the Constitution, but not others? And the answer is they can violate whatever provision they want as long as the people don't get up in arms about it. And that's where this unwritten tradition seems to emerge, and this part seems to define it all. This is that cloud. And you draw a big circle around the cloud and you say, okay, whatever's in there, that's what we're doing. Whatever is not in there, well, let's not worry about it.
Well, it's interesting because you're coming to the same conclusion on the political side that I've come to on the economic side, which is the government spends so much money because the people are allowing the politicians to do so.
Even requiring.
Right. And so too on the political side.
There was one book, An Economic Interpretation of the United States Constitution. It was written by Charles Beard, a real diehard critic of the Constitution. And the book was filled with all kinds of idiocy, right? Not only was it stupid, it was disingenuous. He played with the text in ways that you really ought not. But the idea that there could be an economic interpretation of the United States Constitution is fascinating. And maybe that should be our next book. This is something that is right on the burner for somebody to go grab and take. Because the tools of economics explain what politicians do better than the tools of political science. And that's kind of interesting. Now, Beard was wrong about almost everything he wrote about, but I think he was right about the methodology. You have to do it honestly, which he could not do for whatever his reason. It's no surprise that he'd come to crackpot conclusions, given that he wrote at the very inception point of the progressive era in the United States. He was just another progressive lunatic. As it goes, it seems to be the case that the federal government could do anything it wants. Why? Because a branch of the federal government, the Supreme Court, will decide in the end whether it's acceptable. And lo and behold, the federal government almost always finds in favor of the federal government. That's a way to look at this that most people just zone right out of. They don't realize that you've got one part of the federal government deciding if the other part of the federal government is working in good faith.
And I can't help but wonder that our presidential elections have become so divisive because of that one power that presidents have, and that's to appoint members to the Supreme Court. That somehow people have come to understand that's what matters.
And it does matter in exactly the way people think, which is why when Trump was in the Oval Office, he got a couple of opportunities to put people on that court, people who will likely be there for the next 30 years. If you look back and you think, well, what harm did Antonin Scalia do? You got to be kidding me. From a leftist perspective, he did so much damage, it's not even funny. An Earl Warren on the other side, if you really want to play this game. So I think we probably have to admit that the stakes are very high, at least in that way. And because they're so high, we should expect to see things like the presidential election being more important in the minds of the people than any other election. And that's exactly what we see. The people are reasonable in their own way. You can't tell them what to do or what to think is important, but once they figure something out, they stick to it pretty hard.
Well, it's kind of interesting now that we're talking about it. I'm drawing parallels to the kerfluffles that come up every election season with the Electoral College. The way the whole system was designed, the people are supposed to elect the electors, and the electors go and elect the president on our behalf. And yet that's kind of what we're describing with the president and the Supreme Court. The people will elect the president, and then the president will appoint the Supreme Court. He becomes almost like the Electoral College.
That's right. It's a filtering mechanism, which every single thing in the federal government was at the end of a filtering mechanism, except the election of the House of Representatives. That was the one thing that the people could vote on directly. So you went to the polls and you had a choice who your representative in the House of Representatives would be. You didn't vote directly on senators. That was from state legislatures. And you certainly didn't vote for a president. That was filtered through the Electoral College. And this was the design. The design was to keep regular people at arm's length because they don't have the tools, so thought the founders, to choose correctly or wisely.
And the evidence suggests that the founders were right.
Well, the evidence always suggests that the founders were right. These guys really thought long and hard about these things. They didn't have emotional answers to questions. They sat in Independence Hall in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, sweating their asses off trying to figure out how to run a country. And they came up with a pretty brilliant answer. Perfect? No, nothing is perfect. Better than anything that had ever come before it in human history, without question. And from there, we have done what we have done, and we have beaten back certain elements of the Constitution over time to where I don't think the words on the page matter. At least they don't matter in the way they should have given the original design. Some of the words really matter. Other of the words don't matter at all. And as long as the people give their blessing, if they seal their imprimatur on these things that the Congress, President, and Supreme Court do collectively, that's all you really need. It doesn't matter what the words on the page say, as long as you fall in line believing what's been put in front of you. That's a brave new constitutional world there. The Constitution was fundamentally a limiting factor. It limited what government can do. It doesn't do that anymore. What's emerged has been a constitutional tradition that takes very little notice of the words on the page of the Constitution. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week. Until then, follow us on Twitter. Handles are, as always, in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, where the conversation continues. And
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Idiot.
Wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com. Act before midnight tonight. That's wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
You could see him reaching for the lead paint chips as a baby in his crib, gobbling them right down, thinking to himself, ooh, these are tasty. What could possibly go wrong? But there it is. Anyhow, we'll see you next week when we've got something, well, at least as interesting as this in the cards. And until then, as mentioned earlier, please be nice to each other. Be nice to each other. And I'll catch you later.
See you next week, James.